The night of June 5th, 1944, was darker than hell itself. Private First Class Joseph Birrell sat in the belly of the C-47 transport plane, the roar of engines drowning out everything but his own racing heartbeat. Around him, 23 other paratroopers from the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment checked their equipment one final time. Static lines, reserve chutes, rifles, grenades. Each man carried over 100 pounds of gear strapped to a body that weighed, on average, only 160 pounds. They were about to jump into Nazi-occupied France. Joe was 20 years old. Just 3 years earlier, he'd been playing high school football in Muskegon, Michigan, dreaming about girls and wondering what he'd do after graduation. Now he was hurtling through the darkness toward a drop zone that intelligence said would be lightly defended. Intelligence was wrong. Intelligence was almost always wrong. The red light blinked on. The jumpmaster moved to the door, and suddenly the cabin filled with the rush of wind and the distant thump of anti-aircraft fire. Through the open door, Joe could see tracers arcing up from the ground like deadly fireworks. The Germans knew they were coming. "Stand up! Hook up!" Joe stood, his legs shaking not from fear, he told himself, but from the vibration of the aircraft. His static line clicked into place on the overhead cable. Check equipment. Hands moved in practiced rhythm, checking the man in front, the man behind. The plane lurched violently. A burst of flak tore through the fuselage, and suddenly the man next to Joe, a kid from Tennessee named Matthews, was gone. Not jumped, just gone. Sucked out through a hole in the aircraft's side that hadn't been there a second before. Go, go, go. There was no time to think. No time to mourn. The green light flashed, and Joe was moving, shuffling forward in the line, and then he was at the door, and then he was out, tumbling into the screaming darkness of war. The opening shock of his parachute yanked him upright, and for one brief, crystalline moment, he could see everything. Below him, Normandy was burning. Farmhouses, hedgerows, entire villages lit up like matches. Tracers crisscrossed the sky in deadly geometries. Planes fell, trailing fire like dying meteors. Paratroopers dangled from trees, from telephone poles, hung motionless as targets in a shooting gallery. Joe had trained for this moment for 2 years. But nothing, no training exercise, no mock jump, no instructor's warning had prepared him for the reality of combat. A bullet cracked past his head, so close he felt the heat of it. Another tore through his canopy. He was drifting toward a cluster of buildings, a farm maybe, or a German outpost. He pulled desperately on his risers, trying to steer away, but the wind had other plans. The ground rushed up faster than expected. He hit hard, rolled, came up tangled in his shroud lines with his rifle somewhere in the darkness and the sound of German voices shouting nearby. Joe cut himself free from his chute and lay flat in the wet grass, breathing hard, trying to get his bearings. The plan had been to land in Drop Zone D, link up with his unit, and move to secure the beach exits for the amphibious invasion that would begin at dawn. Simple. Clean. Military precision. But plans died the moment bullets started flying. He had no idea where he was. The landmarks he'd memorized from aerial photographs were nowhere to be seen. The clouds had scattered the formation, and now paratroopers were scattered across 50 square miles of enemy territory. Some had landed in trees. Some had landed in the flooded marshes the Germans had created and drowned under the weight of their equipment. Some had landed directly on German positions and been cut down before their boots touched French soil. Joe heard a metallic click behind him, the unmistakable sound of a rifle bolt. He froze. Flash. Came a whispered challenge from the darkness. The password. Thunder and Flash. The 101st Airborne's recognition signal for D-Day. Thunder. Joe whispered back, nearly weak with relief. A figure emerged from the hedgerow, another paratrooper. His face blackened with camouflage paint, his eyes wide and wild. "Where the hell are we?" the man asked. "I don't know," Joe admitted. "I lost my cricket." The small metal noisemaker that would have helped him signal other Americans silently was gone, probably torn away during the jump. Mine too. Everything's foobar. The man moved closer, and Joe could see now that he was wounded, blood soaked through his jump jacket near the shoulder. "I'm heading east, trying to find the rally point. You coming?" Before Joe could answer, the hedgerow exploded with gunfire. The wounded paratrooper went down without a sound. Joe dove left, rolled behind a stone well, his hand scrabbling for his rifle. But his rifle was gone, still tangled in his parachute shroud somewhere in the darkness. He had only his knife, a single grenade, and his .45 pistol. German voices shouted commands. Boots pounded on packed earth. A flare shot up, turning night into day, and Joe pressed himself against the cold stone of the well, making himself as small as possible. He was alone, cut off, surrounded by an enemy that outnumbered him 100 to 1. And the sun wouldn't rise for another 4 hours. This was just the beginning of Private First Class Joseph Barely's war. What happened over the next 72 hours would become the stuff of legend, a story of survival, cunning, and sheer bloody-minded determination that would make even hardened veterans shake their heads in disbelief. But right now, crouched behind that well with German soldiers closing in, Joe had only one thought running through his mind. The flare hung in the sky like a miniature sun, bleaching the world into harsh whites and deep blacks. Joe didn't breathe, didn't move. The German patrol was less than 20 yards away, 4 soldiers moving in a standard sweep pattern, their Mauser rifles at the ready. He could hear their equipment rattling, could smell their cigarette smoke on the wind. One of them said something in German and laughed. Another kicked at the body of the American paratrooper, making sure he was dead. Joe's hand moved slowly, silently, to the grenade on his belt. If they found him, he'd take at least 2 of them with him. It was the only play he had left. But then, a miracle. A burst of machine gun fire erupted from somewhere to the south, another firefight in the chaos of the invasion. The German patrol leader shouted an order, and the 4 soldiers took off running toward the sound, leaving Joe alone in the darkness once more. The flare sputtered out. The night rushed back in. Joe remained frozen for a full minute, maybe 2, waiting to see if it was a trick. When no one returned, he moved. First, he crawled to the dead paratrooper and checked his dog tags. "Private Ellis, from Georgia." Joe whispered a quick prayer and took Ellis's rifle, ammunition, and crickets. He had to keep moving. Staying in one place meant death. He moved through the hedgerows like a ghost, using every bit of training he'd absorbed. The hedgerows of Normandy were ancient, thick earthen walls covered in dense vegetation, some of them dating back to Roman times. They created a maze of narrow fields separated by barriers that were perfect for defense and absolutely hellish for attackers. The Germans knew this. They'd had 4 years to prepare. Dawn was beginning to break, painting the eastern sky in shades of gray and pink that would have been beautiful under any other circumstances. Joe could hear the war intensifying. To the north, naval guns boomed like thunder, the invasion fleet beginning its bombardment of the beaches. To the east and west, small arms fire crackled and popped. Paratroopers and Germans were fighting hundreds of small, desperate battles across the countryside. Joe came upon a road and froze. A German convoy was moving along at trucks, half-tracks, troops marching in formation. They were heading toward the beaches, toward the invasion. He had to stop them, or at least slow them down. But he was one man. What could one man do? Then he remembered the demolition charges every paratrooper carried. He still had his 2 blocks of TNT with timed fuses. He'd been trained as a demolition specialist, one of the men tasked with blowing bridges and obstacles. Joe watched the convoy for 15 minutes, counting vehicles, timing the intervals. There was a stone bridge a quarter mile up the road. If he could blow that bridge right as the convoy crossed it, it was insane. It was suicide. But it might buy the men on the beaches precious time. He moved along the hedgerow, staying low, racing to reach the bridge before the convoy. His lungs burned. His legs screamed. The equipment weighed him down like chains. But he ran. He reached the bridge with maybe 5 minutes to spare. It was old, probably medieval, built from massive blocks of limestone that had supported farmers' carts for centuries and now groaned under the weight of German armor. Joe scrambled down to the underside of the bridge, where the arch met the stone supports. His hands were shaking as he placed the charges, as he set the fuses. 30 seconds. That's all he could give himself, 30 seconds to place the explosives and get clear. The rumble of diesel engines grew louder. The convoy was coming. Joe struck the fuse igniter. The cord hissed to life, sparking and spitting. 30 seconds. He scrambled up the embankment, slipped on the wet grass, fell, got up, kept running. 20 seconds. He dove behind a hedgerow 200 yards from the bridge. 15 seconds. The first truck rolled onto the bridge. Then the second. A half-track. Another truck loaded with troops. 10 seconds. Joe pressed his face into the earth, covered his head with his arms. 5 seconds. 4. 3. The explosion was like the end of the world. The bridge simply ceased to exist. One moment it was there, solid stone that had stood for 800 years. The next moment it was transformed into a fountain of rock and fire that climbed 200 feet into the dawn sky. The lead truck disappeared into the fireball. The half-track behind it tipped forward into the newly created chasm, its occupants screaming as they fell. The concussion wave flattened the grass around Joe, pressed the air from his lungs. Debris rained down, chunks of stone, twisted metal, things he didn't want to identify. When the smoke began to clear, the German convoy was in chaos. The bridge was gone, replaced by a smoking crater. The vehicles behind it were stopping, turning around, looking for another route. Officers were shouting. Men were running in confusion. Joe had bought them time, maybe an hour, maybe more. But now every German in a 5-mile radius knew approximately where he was. And they would come looking. He ran. For the next 12 hours, Joe became a ghost, haunting the Norman countryside. He moved through fields where wheat grew, alongside the bodies of dead paratroopers. He crawled through ditches filled with water and blood. He hid in barns while German search parties passed within feet of him. He ate nothing, drank from puddles and streams. Every sound made him flinch. Every shadow might be death. He encountered other American small groups of paratroopers who'd managed to find each other in the chaos. But each time, before he could link up with them, German patrols would appear and the firefights would begin. And Joe would have to move on. Always alone. Always just one step ahead of capture. By nightfall of June 6th, he'd crossed 15 miles of enemy territory. He'd sabotaged 2 more German positions with his remaining explosives. He'd killed 3 enemy soldiers in close combat encounters so sudden and brutal that he barely remembered them afterward, his mind mercifully editing out the worst details. He found temporary shelter in a destroyed church, its walls pockmarked with bullet holes, its stained glass windows blown out by artillery. He collapsed behind the altar, his body finally giving in to exhaustion, and for 2 hours he slept the dreamless sleep of the dead. He woke to voices. German voices. They were inside the church. Joe's blood turned to ice. His rifle was next to him, but firing it would bring dozens more soldiers. His knife was an option, but there were at least 4 of them, maybe more. He heard boots on stone, moving closer to the altar. A flashlight beam played across the walls. And then, a different sound cut through the night. The distinctive crack of an American M1 Garand rifle. Then another. Then a whole symphony of them. Somewhere nearby, a group of Americans had engaged the Germans. The soldiers in the church ran out to join the fight, and Joe was alone again. He slipped out through a hole in the back wall and melted into the darkness. June 7th, 1944. Day 2 of the invasion. Day 2 of Joe's solitary war. The Atlantic Wall was broken. The beaches were secured. But the battle for Normandy had just begun, and Private First Class Joseph Barely was still deep behind enemy lines, still fighting, still surviving against odds that no reasonable person would have bet on. He had no way of knowing that the worst was yet to come, that his real test, the moment that would define him forever, was still ahead. waiting in a small French village whose name he didn't even know. A village where he would make a choice between his mission and his humanity. A choice that would haunt him for the rest of his life. June 8th, 1944. 72 hours since Joe had jumped from that C-47. He was a walking corpse. His uniform was torn and caked with mud and blood, some of it his own, most of it not. He'd lost count of how many times he'd nearly died. A sniper's bullet that missed his head by inches. A patrol dog that somehow didn't smell him as he lay submerged in a drainage ditch breathing through a reed. A German officer who walked past the haystack where Joe was hiding, stopped, turned back, looked directly at the spot where Joe was concealed, and then walked on. Luck. Divine intervention. Fate. He was low on ammunition. Down to his last grenade. He hadn't eaten in 3 days. His canteen was empty. He'd watched American bombers fly overhead toward Germany and wanted to scream up at them, wanted them to know he was down here, still fighting, still alive. But they couldn't hear him. No one could. That's when he found the village. It didn't have a name on his map, just a cluster of buildings tucked into a valley between 2 hills. Smoke rose from a few chimneys. It looked peaceful, normal, like the war hadn't touched it yet. But something was wrong. Joe could feel it. He moved closer, using the tree line for cover, and that's when he saw them. German soldiers, dozens of them, positioned around the village, not defending it, guarding it, keeping something in. And then he heard the sound that made his blood run cold. Children crying. Joe crept closer, his heart pounding so hard he was sure the Germans would hear it. He reached a stone wall that bordered a farmyard and peered over. What he saw stopped his breath. The village square had been turned into a makeshift prison camp. 40, maybe 50 French civilians were huddled together. Old men, women, children, even infants. They were surrounded by armed guards. And at the edge of the square, German soldiers were digging a mass grave. Joe understood immediately. This was a reprisal. The Germans were going to execute these people. Maybe they'd help the resistance. Maybe they'd hidden Allied soldiers. Or maybe, and this was more likely, the Germans were just making an example. Terror was a weapon, and they wielded it with precision. Joe watched as a German officer, an SS Hauptsturmführer, a captain, addressed the prisoners in broken French. Joe's high school French was rusty, but he caught enough. The village would be punished. This was the price of resistance. This was what happened when you helped the invaders. The execution would begin at sunset, 2 hours away. Joe slid back down behind the wall, his mind racing. This wasn't his mission. His mission was to disrupt German communications, to harass supply lines, to survive and link up with American forces. Saving French civilians wasn't in the orders. But orders meant nothing when he closed his eyes and saw those children's faces. He had 1 grenade, 38 rounds of ammunition, a knife, and his wits against 40 German soldiers. The rational part of his brain, the part that had kept him alive for 3 days, was screaming at him to walk away. You can't save them. You'll die trying. Your death won't change anything. But the other part, the part that remembered why he'd enlisted in the first place, the part that still believed in something bigger than survival, that part wouldn't let him leave. Joe studied the village layout. The Germans were concentrated in the square. They had 2 machine gun positions, one covering the north approach, one covering the east. Guards were posted at intervals around the perimeter. They were professional, disciplined. This was going to be impossible, unless he could create chaos, unless he could make them think they were under attack by a much larger force. An idea formed, insane, desperate, but it might work. The sun was sinking toward the horizon. He had maybe 90 minutes. Joe moved through the surrounding farms like a shadow, collecting materials, gasoline from a barn, rags from a clothesline, empty bottles from a trash heap. He worked quickly, assembling crude Molotov cocktails, the weapons of partisans and desperate men. He positioned them at 4 points around the village, each one hidden and ready. Then he found a position on the hillside, with a clear view of the square and the 2 machine gun nests. The sun touched the horizon. The German officer began reading names from a list. Joe struck a match. The first Molotov cocktail exploded on the eastern edge of the village, sending flames climbing up a wooden shed. Seconds later, the second one went off to the north, a burst of orange fire in the gathering dusk. Confusion rippled through the German ranks. Officers shouted. Soldiers turned, trying to identify the threat. Joe opened fire on the eastern machine gun nest. 3 quick shots. The gunner went down. His loader scrambled to take over. Joe was already moving, sprinting to his second position. He fired at the northern machine gun nest from a different angle. The Germans were spinning now, trying to figure out where the attacks were coming from, how many attackers there were. The third and fourth Molotov cocktails went off. Joe had rigged them with delayed fuses made from cigarettes. More fire. More chaos. In the square, the prisoners were screaming, scrambling, not knowing whether to run or stay. Some of the younger men saw their opportunity and bolted for the buildings. Guards fired wildly, hitting walls and dirt. Joe threw his last grenade. It landed near a German supply truck and detonated with a thunderous crack. The truck's fuel tank caught fire, and suddenly there was real panic. The SS officer was screaming orders, trying to restore discipline, but his men were scattered, fighting enemies they couldn't see, fires they couldn't control. Joe fired his last rounds at the German positions, not trying to kill, just trying to keep them pinned down, keep them confused. Then his rifle clicked empty. He was out of ammunition, out of explosives, out of tricks. But the prisoners were running now, streaming out of the square, disappearing into buildings, into fields, into the darkening countryside. An old woman grabbed 2 small children and ran. A teenage boy helped his grandmother over a stone wall. They were escaping. Not all of them would make it. Joe could see German soldiers recovering, starting to pursue. But some would survive. Maybe half. Maybe more. It would have to be enough. Joe turned to run himself. And that's when he felt the impact, like being kicked by a horse. He looked down and saw blood spreading across his side. He'd been shot. The world tilted. He stumbled, caught himself against a tree. The wound was bad, not immediately fatal, but bad enough. He could feel the strength draining from his legs. He had to move, had to get away before they found him, but his body wasn't cooperating anymore. 3 days of combat, no food, no sleep, and now this. His body was done, finished. Joe collapsed behind a hedgerow and pressed his hand to the wound, trying to stop the bleeding. He could hear German soldiers spreading out, searching. They'd find him soon. He thought about his mother back in Michigan, about whether they'd already gotten the telegram telling them he was missing in action, about whether he'd ever see home. Again, the footsteps grew closer, voices in German. A flashlight beam swept the area. Joe closed his eyes and waited for the end. But the end didn't come. Instead, hands, gentle hands, grabbed him. A voice whispered urgently, in French. He felt himself being dragged, lifted, carried. When he opened his eyes again, he was in a dark cellar. A man and woman, the French resistance, he realized were tending to his wound. The woman had kind eyes. The man had the weathered hands of a farmer. Les Américains, the woman whispered. You saved them. The children. You saved the children. Joe tried to speak, but darkness was closing in from the edges of his vision. Sleep, the woman said in accented English. We hide you. You are safe now. Safe. The word felt foreign. Impossible. But as consciousness slipped away, Joe allowed himself to believe it. Just for a moment, he'd done what he came to do. Not the mission they'd given him, but the mission that mattered. And if this cellar became his tomb, At least those children would have a chance to grow up, to have lives, to remember that once an American stranger had stood between them and death. That would have to be legacy enough. Joe woke to the sound of artillery, distant, rhythmic, like the heartbeat of war itself. He was still in the cellar. His wound had been bandaged with strips of bedsheet. The French couple sat nearby, watching him with anxious eyes. "How long?" Joe croaked. "2 days," the man replied in halting English. "The Germans, they search everywhere, but they not find you." 2 days. That meant it was June 10th. The invasion was nearly a week old. The Allies would be pushing inland by now, expanding the beachhead, fighting through these same hedgerows where Joe had spent 3 days alone. The woman handed him bread and water. Real food. His hands shook as he ate. "The children?" he asked. She smiled, the first genuine smile he'd seen since landing in France. "Safe. All safe. Because of you." That night, under cover of darkness, the French resistance moved him 3 miles through German-occupied territory, from safe house to safe house, until they reached American lines. The GIs who found him didn't believe his story at first. A single paratrooper, alone for 5 days behind enemy lines, sabotaging German positions, saving civilians, surviving impossible odds. It sounded like propaganda, like something from a movie, but his dog tags were real. His uniform, torn and bloodied as it was real. And when they radioed back to his unit, the 506th confirmed. Private First Class Joseph Barely had been listed as missing in action since June 6th. He was real. And so was his story. Joe spent 2 weeks in a field hospital recovering from his wounds. The bullet had missed his vital organs by less than an inch. Another piece of impossible luck in a string of impossibilities. When he was finally released back to duty, his commanding officer pulled him aside. "What you did out there, Beryl, that wasn't in the mission parameters." "No, sir," Joe replied. "You could have been killed. Should have been killed, by all accounts." "Yes, sir." The officer studied him for a long moment. Then he extended his hand. "I'm proud to have you in my unit, soldier." Joe shook his hand, but the words felt hollow. He didn't feel proud. He felt haunted by the faces of the men who hadn't made it. Matthews, sucked out of the plane. Ellis, shot dead in a field. Countless others whose names he'd never know. But he also remembered the children, running, living, free. Maybe that was enough. Maybe that had to be enough. Joe Beryl survived the war. He fought through France, through Belgium, into Germany itself. He was eventually captured by German forces, escaped from a POW camp, was recaptured, escaped again. His luck, it seemed, was inexhaustible. After the war ended, he returned to Michigan. He married, had a family, worked as a tool and die maker. He rarely spoke about D-Day, about those 3 days alone in Normandy. The memories were too raw, too heavy to share with people who hadn't been there. But every June 6th, he would think about that village, about the German officer reading names from a list, about children crying in a square, about the choice he'd made when every rational instinct told him to walk away. Years later, in 2002, Joe returned to Normandy for a commemoration ceremony. An elderly French woman approached him, tears streaming down her face. She'd been one of those children in the village square that day. She'd lived because a 20-year-old American paratrooper had decided that some things were worth dying for. She embraced him. And Joe, this man who had survived the unsurvivable, who had fought alone against impossible odds, finally wept. Not for what he had lost, but for what he had saved. Joseph Beryl died in 2004 at the age of 81, decorated with the Purple Heart, Bronze Star, and numerous other honors. But the medal he treasured most was a simple handmade card from that French woman with a child's drawing and 3 words, "Merci, mon ange." Thank you, my angel. The paratrooper who fought alone for 3 days in Normandy had done more than survive. He had proven that one person, in the darkest moment, faced with impossible odds, can still make a choice that echoes through generations. That even in the heart of hell, humanity endures. That courage isn't the absence of fear, it's the decision to act despite it. And that sometimes the most important mission isn't the one you're given. It's the one you choose.